Sanbonani, good evening, Dumelang, and welcome to episode 163 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zama Khumalo, and welcome to the Thursday edition of the Private Property Podcast. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome, and make sure that you go back to some of our old episodes to catch up on some of the great content that we have brought on your screens. And talking about great content on your screens, we don't only have the Private Property Podcast, we also have a host of other shows that make your home ownership and certainly property journey that much smoother. I'm talking about the First Time Home Buyers show that comes to your screen every Wednesday at 7:45, as well as the farming podcast. If, of course, you've got green fingers and ambitions of going into agriculture, that is on your screens every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1 o'clock. And over the weekend, we bring you the Developers Show, where we profile some of the best estates that the country has on offer. So that's certainly some of the content that you can look forward to here on the private property platforms. And of course, we always continue the conversation, whether you're engaging with us on our Facebook page, where we have over 500,000 of you engaging with us. And we certainly do love hearing from you. Do always, drop a message about some of your lessons that you've learned, not just watching this podcast and what you've used. And I think that's one of the things that we certainly love hearing from you at home. Well, this evening, we're going to be talking about something that I know I don't need to think about just yet because I'm not quite there. But I know that there are people who are in this age group, and maybe it's actually worth thinking about even now, almost preemptively trying to think through what you want to be doing at a later stage when it comes to this. And what I'm talking about is to rent or to buy when deciding which is best when you are retiring. So certainly for those people who are nearing the tail end of them, formally working, perhaps you might be taking, I'd say, early pension at 55, or you're going to stick it out all the way to 65. You want to be thinking through whether you want to be buying your property or renting out a property. I think one of the big things is we mustn't take it for granted that people are able to buy property in their 20s or 30s. So many South Africans can't access, home financing or able to actually buy their home in their earlier life, so in their 20s or 30s or even their 40s, for a whole host of reasons. Sometimes you even find that people were perhaps married and then got divorced, and a divorce may have been closer to like the 50s, and now they're deciding post-divorce, are they just going to rent or are they going to go and try and buy again? So there are different reasons why later on in your life you may find yourself faced with the decision of whether you want to be renting or buying while you're transitioning into retirement. To help us better understand what we should be thinking about when we make this decision, and perhaps some of us that are still much younger can start thinking about this at an early age. I'm joined by Grant Smee, somebody who needs no introduction to the Private Property Podcast, and of course he's the director at Epic South Africa. Grant, good evening and thank you so much for joining us.
Zama, thanks for having me again.
So I was briefly speaking to Grant before he came on air about my hiking adventures this morning, and it was actually quite interesting. I was telling him that, look, this morning I actually hiked morning/afternoon. I hiked for 15 kilometers, so I'm thoroughly out of it. But I'm sure that we're going to have a great conversation about this, because one of the things that always lights up my world is talking about property and finding different ways that we can make better property decisions. Now, Grant, when we think about this, I feel as though so many people, just generally, I think before we even look at whether to buy or to rent in retirement, so many of us, and I'll even almost half raise my hand and say myself included, typically don't think about retirement. I often tweet that retirement things, they overwhelm me and stress me at the same time. And as much as, of course, we all like to live until that age, or perhaps even older, live to 80, you also want to be able to make sure that you have set up your life in such a way that when you do go on retirement, you can actually afford to retire. That if you do decide to work, you're working because you don't want to stay at home or because you just want to keep busy, but not because you financially need to. So I think when we just almost broadly speak about, property and retirement, how should we first broadly be, thinking about it? I think before we even look at, deciding whether to rent or buy, but broadly speaking, how should we be looking at, this asset class that is property, and the different ways that we go about using it when we have the end in mind, and the end being retirement?
Yes, I mean, the one thing you said there, certainly planning for retirement is vitally important. And the reality around property is that it's an asset class that continues growing over time. The value of your property will increase over time. And, if we're talking somebody in their 30s, they've got 35 years to retirement, and that's 35 years of property growth that property can grow in value. Now, one of the problems that comes when you get to retirement age is that most of your value, or most of your rand value from a personal wealth perspective, is actually invested in your own home. Now I say it's problematic because obviously, firstly, that's illiquid, and secondly, you're always going to need somewhere to live. So you get to the stage where you're 65 years old, you've got a 3 million rand home, but all the liquid asset or your liquidity sitting within your property. So it is something that you need to start considering far earlier than as you head towards retirement age. So those of you that are 20, 30 years old do need to start thinking about it now. And I know it's hard to sort of think about that future. But the big thing you have to think about is that with the advance of medicine these days, we're living longer and longer lives. And the reality is although retirement is 62, 65, a lot of people are living to 90, 100 years old. It's actually, I mean, I've got friends who have got grandparents that are living to 97, 98, 100 years old. Now, that reality is going to something that's going to continue happening. So when you retire at 65, you've got a good 35 years that you're going to have to fund. And you're going to have to find a way to make sure that can happen. And property is certainly a very good asset class to start investing in now. And it's never too late to make sure that you do have funds to see you out through your retirement.
Grant, I think when you speak about how we're living long, I think there's, there was a National Geographic cover, I think it may have been 2 years ago, maybe slightly longer. And on the cover, they basically said the human who's going to live to be 100, I think it was 150 or something, like it was a crazy number, has already been born, right? So they're essentially looking at how medical innovation, technological innovation has meant that there are certain diseases we're simply not going to die from because of the way medicine and I suppose even tech is geared right now, and the ease with which some of us are able to live our lives. And it is an interesting thing. And oftentimes when I even speak to insurers, I think for them, it's actually actuaries struggle with this one, because if you've taken out an RA or any other investment product and you're choosing the option that it's going to pay you out, until you essentially die, in the event where you do go in retirement at 55 and you happen to die at 98, the reality is not a lot of people have saved up. So their 2/3 isn't actually sufficient to be going on for longer than they probably contributed to the RA.
Yep.
So it is one of those, interesting developments that I'm keeping quite a keen eye on how we're even going to manage the retirement age. I mean, I know there's even now a few debates around increasing the retirement age. Certainly in different parts of the world, it's slightly more progressed than here at home, because it is that notion of people are living longer than previously anticipated. They've previously gone retirement, perhaps you live like 5 years and then you pass away. So they never had to think about it.
I mean, look, they've increased the retirement age in the UK several times, and that's got a lot to do with the pension black hole, where they didn't foresee people living longer, and actually pension funds were seeing this black hole of people weren't supposed to live longer than 7 years past retirement, and now they're living 20, 30 years where they've got to continue paying. So they have started increasing that. I mean, it's going to be relevant across the world, and it's vitally important. But part two to that is also RAs, pensions. Although there's value in having them in sort of a certain level of security, you don't have any control of that funding. If that company that you've invested in for the last 30, 40 years runs out of money, where's that money going to come from? And you've got no ability to go and get that money from anyone. So personally, I don't have an RA. I've chosen to invest in property, and that's effectively my retirement, because I have, the biggest thing for me is having control over where my money is and the returns I can make on that.
Now, Grant, when we then look at, our conversation this evening, and specifically the topic of renting to buying, perhaps let's look at first, especially at retirement, look at probably like the pros and cons of both, because I think it is then one of those things that some people have to now think about. I mean, I know certain people, for example, who say they don't actually want to buy a property. They'll be perpetual renters. They're quite happy with that. They're not interested in having a home loan. They're certainly not interested in having multiple home loans. Some people say, look, I'll have one home loan, which is my primary residence. I've gotten it now, whether it's in my late 20s or 30s. And the aim is to be able to, pay it off as quickly as possible. So hopefully by the time I'm 50, it's, paid off. And then that's it. So I'm not looking at adding any property or being a property anybody. But how should we then be looking at, let's say, the pros and cons of, let's look at first renting when you're in retirement?
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the pros and one of the big ones, and this is relevant whether you are getting towards retirement age or sort of a lot younger, is if the place that you're looking to live from a lifestyle perspective and also from a convenience perspective, so near family, if you want to live near a beach, you want to live in the bush, wherever that place is, if renting is cheaper than the cost of buying, remembering that buying comes with the cost of your mortgage and a lot of other costs. So I would say to you go and rent in a place if the rent is cheaper than the cost of ownership of a property in that area, because effectively what happens is the owner is therefore supplementing your the cost of you living in a place for lifestyle reasons or convenience reasons. So I'll give you an example. If you're going to buy a 1.5 million rand property in Joburg, and you were going to go rent that same property, your cost of your bond and your maintenance and levies is going to be pretty much the same as your rental cost. If you did exactly the same thing and go and try and buy a 1.5 million rand property, for example, in Cape Town or parts of Cape Town where you can, your cost of your rental is going to be far less than a mortgage. So you could live in Cape Town in a 1.5 million rand property for far less than it costs you to live in a 1.5 million rand property and own it in Joburg. So therefore, it makes sense to rent in Cape Town. So it's just an example of where the cost of renting is lower than the cost of ownership.
And then what would then be the disadvantages, Grant? Because as much as it's great to kind of run those numbers where renting is concerned, and certainly at retirement age, you're also looking at making sure that your expenses are as low as possible. Because I'm realizing it now, because you may get perhaps a payout from your pension fund. You've got your third, you're going to do whatever, but then you're getting your monthly kind of salary that's getting taxed, which upsets me on so many different levels, but that's a conversation for another day. And so you really do want to keep your running costs. Oftentimes estate planners, financial planners often talk to, especially people in their late 40s, going into their 50s, saying that, look, you want to try and close off your debts at this period so that you're also getting yourself ready for when you're in retirement, so that come retirement, you essentially don't have any debt that you're servicing. If anything, by the time you're in retirement, perhaps you might have medical aid or perhaps one or two other debit orders. But for the most part, you don't want to have any consumer debt. So then what would be the disadvantage of renting in retirement?
So firstly on the financial advisors giving you advice in your late 40s, early 50s on getting rid of debt. The big issue I have there, they're still going on the traditional model of the fact that you're probably going to die at 70, which is really not the case. And it ignores the value of leverage in terms of and gearing in terms of property. So I think there's a big, the conversation, although it's about renting and buying in retirement, I think we need to frame it a little bit and say, renting or buying to live and as an investment, which is going to be an ongoing and perpetual provide you perpetual return as you get older. So I think it's important that we're not just having a conversation around your residential property only. So that's the first thing. Although you've got issues around taxation of pensions, I've got issues around financial advisors personally. So
listen, I have the same. But we're not going to go there. I feel like
no.
That's one of those conversations when COVID is done. We'll do drinks and just hunt on about how I have issues with also financial advisors, but also the tax when you are now of pension age. I think that just doesn't make sense to me, but we're not there. Yeah.
So just quickly on the advantage of renting is if you want to have a quite a nomadic lifestyle. So for example, you've got two kids and one child lives in London and one child lives in Australia or all over the country. If you are renting, you've got a bit more flexibility in terms of your ability to pick up and go. So that's the one thing. The negative on renting, however, is that you don't have control. So the landlord might decide to sell the property, and now you've just settled in, you've been there for 18 months, and the landlord decides to sell, and therefore you've got to now move out. So that's one of the negatives. On the flip side, the positive of renting is that a lot of the maintenance costs, the levies, the rates and taxes aren't for your account; they're for the owner's account. So again, it's a reduction in costs of living in their property. So there really is sort of a mixed space here. But I think the big advantage for people who are retired, particularly if you've got the ability to travel, is that there's this flexibility in terms of rental, certainly.
I'm in conversation with Grant Smee as a director at Epic South Africa. We're looking at, deciding whether to rent or buy when it comes to your retirement age. You're looking at buying a home that you're going to live in. We already know that so many people are living well beyond the age of 70. So when you're thinking retirement, it really isn't the end of, your life. If anything, it's a very interesting, or perhaps a new book if you even want it to be, and probably a different way for you to potentially reinvent yourself. If you've perhaps are of retirement age or approaching retirement age, how are you thinking about whether or not you want to be renting during that period, or you want to stay in your own home, or looking at buying your own home closer to retirement, or perhaps somebody in your family or some of your friends have done a particular thing that's similar, where they're renting or living or buying their own property? What has been their experience with this one? And as I was saying earlier, retirement is one of those things that we often don't think about. And everybody who's good when it comes to financial advice will tell you that you need to start as early as possible, and you want to cultivate a culture of gearing your life towards making sure that you'll still be able to live the kind of life that you want to live even after you've sort of stopped formally working. And so it really is one of those things that even us now, I'm 30, I get stressed when I just think about retirement. And even though there are different decisions that I've made that I know have set me up really well for retirement, I'm still overwhelmed by retirement. So if you've probably seen me on Twitter, I always tweet about how frustrating but also overwhelming the thought of retirement typically is. Well, we're going to go for a quick break. We'll be taking your questions and comments on this one. Do share your experience, and it might even be an experience of a loved one, because I think it is one of those things where some of us might be young, luckily, and don't have to deal with it right now. But this is certainly one of those decisions that we're going to have to make in the coming future. We're going to be back just after this. Welcome back to the Thursday edition of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zama. This evening, we're talking about a subject that I know my peers don't think about too much, but it certainly is one of those things that we need to start thinking about and making sure that we actively put things in place to make sure that we are best equipped and ready when the time comes, because I think it's also not a if, but it's an ultimately when the time comes. And we're looking at to rent or to buy, deciding which is best when retiring. Before the break, we explored the rental aspect of things, and now we're going to switch things over to the buying side of things. But before we get there, we are taking your questions and comments on our different platforms, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, do send them through down here below. And I see Donaldo Scott's coming through first with a comment saying, for me, buying a property is better than renting because you can leave a legacy behind. And Donaldo also continues to say, I did read an article which stated that you can buy a property where you use your pension as a security fund, a backup. Like, for example, if your pension is on 650K, you can buy a property of 600K, and something happens to you, or your pension will pay your bond. Essentially, that's a pension-backed home loan. And this is something I promise we'll get a guest on. I'm very intrigued by it. I've seen a few people who've done it. And it's a very interesting concept. I love the concept for different reasons. And I love the flexibility that it also gives you. I've seen people being able to, take a pension-backed home loan. The interest rates right now are great, so they're enjoying that benefit. But you're also finding that you get the cash straight. So you get the cash yourself, and you're able to essentially use it in different ways as you'd like. So that is one of the things that I've picked up with a pension-backed home loan. So Dinalo, I do promise that we will have a guest that will, and from a bank, who will talk to us about pension-backed home loans, and to just get a better sense of how they essentially work, what we should be mindful of in the event where we want to walk that particular path. But then, Grant, we've explored the renting aspect, and now let's move on over to the buying side, because I think one of the things, the reality is, sometimes when people reach retirement age or approaching retirement age, as I was saying earlier, they may not necessarily own their home or own a home. They may still, in that period, still be renting for a whole host of different reasons. Some people you find were recently divorced, and end up finding themselves first, renting to get on their feet, and then perhaps now want to explore buying a property. Oftentimes when you retire, they may get that third, perhaps they want to put that down as a very big deposit into the home that they want to be buying. How should we be thinking about buying when it comes to retiring?
Yeah, so I mean, the one thing about buying when you are retiring is obviously first and foremost security. As you get older, the security it provides you is quite important for a lot of people. So where I spoke about on the renting side, you got this flexibility to travel and move around. Some people do just want to make sure that they've got security of where they stay. They can make it a home, and they can sort of live quite sort of almost hassle-free in that space. The negative about that, again, and I mentioned it earlier, was the cost of ownership. So, if you're going to buy into, for example, a complex, where you want some security, particularly from a South African context, you've got your levies to pay, you've got your rates and taxes, you're going to have to maintain your property. So those are costs that you're going to have to incur. If you then take it one step further and you move into sort of these retirement schemes or retirement villages, there's also additional costs there because they provide additional services. What you got to remember when you go into a sectional title complex, no matter what the additional services are, for example, a gym, a clubhouse, care facilities, nursing facilities, is that cost has to be borne by somebody, and that's all rolled into the levy. So those levies can actually be quite substantial. So although you provides you security and you can settle in that home quite easily, the costs of that also can be quite substantial. So it's a real balancing act in terms of buying. There was a comment from the viewer there saying, look, you can leave a legacy behind. That legacy doesn't mean it doesn't have to be the property you're staying in. That's something that I really want to sort of emphasize here, is that make sure that the property you're staying in suits your lifestyle. And whether you rent or buy, that it actually doesn't matter, because it suits your lifestyle and what you've actually worked your entire life to try and achieve and where you want to be. And then if you do have the ability to buy a property, consider the fact that you can rent a property and you can buy an investment property elsewhere. So obviously there's a difference in how your property is treated once you pass away, from a primary residence point of view or investment point of view, for taxation for your estate. But the reality here is sometimes it's better to leave from a legacy point of view an investment that's providing a return to your children, rather than a home that they're going to have to sell because there's no investment potential there.
We've got a question here from YouTube coming in from Josetsile Dube, who asks, who comments, I think renting gives you so much financial security than when buying, but buying helps when it comes to legacy and investment. Also echoing what Delana Scholz and what you were saying earlier, Grant. I actually want to pick up on the retirement villages, because I think we are now seeing the rise of retirement estates. I don't know, it's almost like somebody, I know they're quite a big thing, in the UK and other markets, but it's almost as though somebody saw it that side and was like, I'm bringing it here, and they're now cropping up everywhere. What's your take on that? Because one of the things that I actually found, and you actually mentioned it, that even when you look at something like a retirement village, the amenities that they offer and the services that they're going to offer, those come at a cost, and that cost has to be paid by somebody, and that somebody more often than not is going to obviously be you as a person living in there, or perhaps even your children, who are the ones who might, say you need to be moving in there. There's I won't name the building, but there's actually a retirement, village I came across in KZN. Yeah, let's keep it broad enough. KZN, the units are going for literally probably the most expensive apartment is at a stretch is like 150K, right? So they're quite low price. I think perhaps the average price for an apartment there is somewhere around 90K. And yet the levies that you pay range from 6 to 8K. And that's where I realized that for them, they're not in the business of selling the actual property, as it were. So they keep that cost low because they know that all the other services that they're providing, that's essentially their cash cow. So I think, what's your view on even opting to go to, I'll say, a retirement village? Because I find a lot of them do have quite high costs, because it's not just a normal, certainly for a lot of the ones that I've kind of viewed, it's not just a normal sectional title that just has the normal stuff that we have in our normal complexes or estates. There are those added services that I suppose an elderly person would typically need. And so levies do tend to be higher than normal.
Look, the unfortunate reality here is we all hope that we're perfectly healthy until the day we die, but that's not certainly a reality for everybody. So there are some of those services that you are going to potentially need. I think you need to gauge where you are, and a problem with a lot of retirement villages, firstly, is long waiting lists. So some people will try and get in early, but they are then paying for services they're not going to need for potentially 15, 20 years. So you do need to gauge the cost, and when you go into the retirement village, you need to understand really what are you getting, what do you need, and what are the costs you're going to be paying on an ongoing basis for that. One thing about the retirement villages, what I think is a good thing, is that it creates a sense of community. A lot of people do lose partners as they get older, might lose a partner early. And one of the very important things as people are getting older is that they do have this community, and they do have people that they can interact with, and peers that they can have conversations with, everything else. So I think that there's good and there's bad. The costs can be really, really high. So I think you need to go in, very much aware of firstly the cost that you have. Second one is, when you're buying these retirement villages at a very low cost, often you're actually buying life rights. You're not buying the property itself, but you're buying rights to that property for the period of your life. So once you pass away, you're actually not leaving legacy behind, because your rights go with you, and therefore the property goes almost back on the market again. So you do need to be aware whether you are actually buying the property or you're buying life rights into these estates, if your intention is to leave legacy behind.
We've got a comment here from Howard Mukatan. Howard, I haven't seen you in a while. And Howard says, buy multiple properties into a family trust for consistency, then rent out anywhere where you'd like to be, and retain the flexibility of movement while getting multiple rental incomes. And I see here on YouTube, we've also got Jose saying, what if when you retire, you still cannot afford your comfortable home? So essentially, how do we look at because this is also another reality, right? The reality of not perhaps being able to afford to still buy a property even in your retirement. So even when you've sort of gotten your 1/3, and you still find that maybe the bank is reluctant to extend even a small bond facility for you because of whatever reason, how do you then kind of make the best decision to mitigate that for yourself?
So first one, I just want to comment quickly on sort of Howard's comment around buying properties in a trust and then renting them out and having flexibility. I think it's important to realize that you need to get some tax advice and estate advice around that. I don't necessarily think buying direct in a trust is the best option for somebody. But I'm not going to give sort of estate and tax advice here. I just think it's worthwhile having a conversation with somebody who understands the space. There are better structures than that. It does involve a trust, but there's more layers to it. Second one is so what do you do? I mean, you get to retirement age, you don't have the affordability to buy a property, and you really want to maybe have that lifestyle option. And something that I talk about quite a lot in sort of our space is communes, which I think is quite an exciting space. And I think communes generally, particularly in South Africa at the moment, and for whatever reason, I don't know why, is everyone talks about student accommodation and student communes. I think the reality here is that actually communes for elderly people and retired people is actually such a beautiful space because you can be quite selective in where you're going to go. Because if you talk about retirement villages, they're built in very restrictive places. There's very specific places. I mean, in Cape Town, around Century City. Now, I mean, I know in my 70s, I certainly don't want to be sitting in Century City where there's traffic and there's buildings everywhere. I want to be sitting in, I don't know, for example, Langebaan or somewhere near the beach. So the ability for you to create a commune by renting, for example, a 4 or 5 bedroom property, renting out individual rooms, so you create a small retirement community, and you have that sense of lifestyle, shared cost, and again, that community feeling of those retirement villages. There's certainly an option for you to create a commune and then leverage that from a lifestyle perspective.
Grant, I think as you're saying that, one of the things that I'm realizing, and it comes up in sort of different ways, is that we almost need to rethink the way that we're living at different stages of our lives. And this is really, if I even think about when, for example, you start working and you might be in your early or mid-20s, sometimes you may want to jump ahead and just get a nice fancy apartment, live by yourself, get a 2-bed and live by yourself. But sometimes you might actually think that doesn't make the best financial decision. So perhaps rather get a smaller place or still get the 2-bed, but live with a friend in order to be able to split the costs. So we're almost being pushed. And I mean, it's one part capitalism, if we have to be honest, but it's also another part, the way in which sort of trends are moving. We need to be rethinking how we are living at different stages in our lives. I mean, for me, and I've shared this on the podcast before, I'm still struggling to wrap my head around, complex living, because I grew up in a standalone home. And so I remember when, I moved here, one of the things was the fact that I can park my car, and as I'm walking from my car up to my apartment, I'm meeting essentially strangers, but we share this yard all together. It was just such a difficult concept to wrap my head around. And I think only now, years later, after moving in, am I slowly starting to get it. But it hasn't quite sunk in because I didn't grow up living in, whether it's like a building or certainly in flats. And so that's something that's difficult to kind of wrap my head around. So I think even now, as we're currently in our 20s, 30s, perhaps even 40s, when we start thinking about how do we want to be living in retirement, it may be different from how we've been living for most of our lives. So if, for example, you do choose the retirement village option, and let's say you had been living, in your own standalone home for all these years, your family came and went, and then your kids ended up going off. Now that house might be perhaps too big, and you're thinking, look, maybe rather move in, as you're saying, in a retirement village, so that you're able to have that sense of community, because the reality is your kids are not going to be there all the time. So that's certainly something for us to slowly think about in the different decades of your life. But Grant, I see you want to say something.
I think one of the things you talk about, sort of looking to live differently. I think if COVID and particularly the lockdown shown people anything, is that they need to de-risk their lives. And what I mean by de-risking your life is, if you look at it from a perspective of your employment, you're getting a single income. You need to make sure that's not your only source of income on an ongoing basis. In the same vein, if you're living in a home, you want to make sure that, particularly in retirement, but at any point of your life, you want to make sure that if you do, for example, lose that single income, that you're able to afford your property. So, like you say, rent out to a friend. And I mean, I suppose I've had a different space, and I spent a lot of time in the UK living in communes. And what we did when we started going down the route of investing was we rented out rooms in the places we lived in to make it affordable for us to live there, and remove the need for us to come up with money every month to make payments.
So your Airbnb,
as we went down our own venture.
Airbnb was a thing, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, but not that we were renting out on long-term leases, you know. So yeah, I'd love to claim short-term as my idea. That'd be amazing. But no, we were literally renting out our rooms on long-term. We were creating communes around us, and it was common living in the UK. But what was important was that we then had the ability not to have to pay rent, and our mortgage was covered, in spite of the fact that we might not have an income. And I think we really need to sit back here and say, look, I've got a single income, which is my employment. Is my employer going to be around tomorrow? Well, you don't know. You know, you don't have that ability to have that foresight. So make sure that you've got other ways to cover your costs and expenses. That's either multiple streams of income, which I mean, so many people in the wealth environment talk about, but also multiple ways to pay your expenses, which are ongoing. So if you're renting a property, make sure you've got a housemate in that property. If you rent a property with 2 garages, or you have an own property with 2 garages, rent one of the garages out for storage. Find different ways to offset your costs so that you're not always at risk if your circumstances do change. And again, that's relevant where you're 20, 30, or in your 70s. You know, make sure that you've got different ways to make sure that you can cover your bills and your lifestyle.
Well, Grant, I think that's actually a great place to leave it at this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Zama.
And that is Grant Smee, who's the director at Epic South Africa. I do hope that for those of us who don't like thinking about retirement, we're certainly understanding the importance of making decisions right now that will best or rather put us in the best position when the retirement age reaches us, and hopefully we'll survive COVID, and we will in fact reach that age, that we are able to at this stage make those right decisions that set us up as best as humanly possible. It was always great speaking to Grant. I know we'll have him again on the show in the coming months. And of course, from our side, it has been a pleasure. We're going to be back on your screens tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. And until then, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.
Hi, I'm Brian Kepper. I'm a 10-time South African motorcycling champion. My family and I have chosen to live in Fourways. There's some really great suburbs in our neighborhood. There's a lot of families living in the surrounding areas, in places like Lone Hill and Cedar Lakes. What draws people to Cedar Lakes is that it's so close to the Broadacre Shopping Centre, Cedar Square, and Fourways Life Hospital. Lone Hill is a major draw card for many families. It's got some great smaller commercial centres and some fantastic schools like Crawford College. From an entertainment point of view, Monte Casino really comes alive at night. There's so much on the go, and there's an incredible energy in the area. Our family just loves the fast-paced lifestyle that Fourways brings. But honestly, the thing that attracted us most to this area was the active lifestyle that it offers. As a family, we've chosen to live in Fourways because of the lifestyle and convenience, and this is our neighborhood.